All right, so uh, let's dive into something that I think is pretty timely, and that's how the European defense industry is really grappling with the need to seriously ramp up production,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
with everything going on in the world. It's
Mm.
a question that's top of mind for a lot of folks, and
Let's hear it.
we've got some excerpts from this German document called Aufrüsten wie noch nie, which translates to arming like never before.
Wow.
And it really gets into the nitty-gritty of what it would take for Europe to, well, arm itself like never before.
It's not just about building more weapons.
Right.
It's about rethinking Europe's entire defense posture.
Exactly.
And the document doesn't sugarcoat the challenges.
Yeah.
And the first one they tackle is the elephant in the room.
Okay.
The cost.
Yeah, we're not talking about a little budget bump here.
Well,
This is a massive financial undertaking.
Absolutely.
The document actually cites several different cost estimates,
Right.
which I found interesting because it shows just how complex this issue is.
Yeah. It's like trying to budget for a home renovation when you're not even sure what the final blueprint looks like.
Right.
The EU Commission, for example, has their Rearm Europe plan,
Uh-huh.
which aims to bolster European defense capabilities. And they're talking about a budget of nearly 800 billion euros.
800 billion, that's a huge number. But I guess it makes sense when you consider the scale of what they're trying to do.
Right. But that figure covers a relatively short time frame.
Okay.
Then you have the Bertelsmann Stiftung,
Okay.
a German think tank,
Okay.
that came up with a lower figure of 610 billion euros.
Okay.
But they're looking at a much longer period, 15 years.
Oh, wow. And they're factoring in a pretty significant wild card, the possibility of the U.S. scaling back its military presence in Europe.
Exactly.
If that happens, Europe would have to pick up a lot more of the slack, and that's where those costs really start to climb.
Exactly. And then you have economists like Moritz Schularik who are looking at it from a GDP perspective. He estimates Germany alone would need to spend an additional 3.5% of its GDP on defense.
Wow.
So we've got these different numbers flying around, and it raises a question for you. Which estimate is most realistic?
Right.
And what are the assumptions underpinning each one?
Yeah.
Because those assumptions have huge implications for how we understand the scope of the challenge.
It's almost like everyone agrees that more money needs to be spent,
Right.
but no one's quite sure how much more. So let's say hypothetically,
Yeah.
we found the money. Where does it go?
Right.
What are the priorities?
Well, there seems to be a pretty clear consensus that shoring up missile and drone defense systems is at the top of the list.
Okay.
The EU Commission is especially focused on this area.
Makes sense given the evolving nature of warfare and the increasing use of drones in conflicts.
Yeah.
But what's the approach here? Are we talking about buying off-the-shelf American systems like the Patriot missiles?
Right.
Or is Europe looking to develop its own solutions?
That's the debate, isn't it?
Yeah.
The document actually mentions a potential European contender,
Oh, okay.
the French-Italian SAMPT-NG system.
Okay.
But as with everything else, there are trade-offs.
Right, because going with a proven system like the Patriot means you're getting something that's battle-tested.
For sure.
But it also means you're relying on another country for a critical part of your defense.
And that dependence comes with its own risks, both strategically and politically.
Right.
On the other hand, building your own cutting-edge system takes time, money, and expertise, things that might be in short supply, especially if you need to ramp up production quickly.
And there's another wrinkle the document mentions that even if you have a promising system like the SAMPT-NG,
Yeah.
you're limited by production capacity. They say only 1 to 2 of those systems can be produced each year.
Which brings us to a point raised by Torben Schutz,
Okay.
a military expert cited in the document.
Uh-huh.
He argues that simply replicating U.S. systems isn't the answer.
Okay.
Europe needs to leverage its own strengths and develop solutions that are tailored to its specific needs and context.
So it's not just about throwing money at the problem. It's about being smart and strategic about how you spend it.
Exactly.
And maybe that means taking some risks and investing in new technologies.
It's about finding the right balance between tried and true solutions and cutting-edge innovations.
Yeah.
The document touches on this debate between high-tech versus traditional weaponry.
Okay.
For example, there's this idea of a drone wall to protect Europe's eastern border, a concept put forward by the economist Schularik we mentioned earlier.
A drone wall sounds like something out of science fiction.
Yeah.
But I guess it speaks to the need for creative thinking in this new era of warfare.
But then you have someone like Schutz who points to the effectiveness of traditional artillery in the Ukraine conflict, reminding us that sometimes the old ways are still the best.
Right.
He advocates for a layered approach to defense, with a mix of physical barriers, mines, helicopters equipped with anti-tank missiles, and so on.
Wow.
It's about having a diverse toolkit, not just relying on one silver bullet.
So we're talking about flexibility and adaptability,
Right.
being able to respond to a wide range of threats, not just focusing on one particular scenario.
Exactly.
But that raises a pretty fundamental question. Can Europe actually deliver on all of this? Does the European defense industry even have the capacity to ramp up production to the levels we're talking about?
It's a question the document grapples with directly.
Okay.
And while it acknowledges the overall technological capabilities of the European defense industry, praising its high level of expertise, there's a big but.
I was wondering when the but was coming.
Right. There's always a but.
And that but has to do with dependence on U.S. suppliers for some pretty critical technologies.
Okay.
Things like heavy transport helicopters, fifth-generation fighter jets, and long-range artillery.
So even if Europe has the money and the will to boost its defense production, it might be missing some crucial pieces of the puzzle. What are the options then? Does the document offer any solutions?
It does explore the possibility of finding alternative suppliers,
Such as South Korea, Israel, or Turkey.
which, as you can imagine, opens up a whole other set of geopolitical considerations.
Absolutely.
For sure. Partnering with new suppliers can be a tricky business, both politically and logistically. But even if we set those issues aside,
Yeah.
is there even enough production capacity outside the U.S. to meet Europe's needs?
It's not a simple equation.
Right.
The document points out that while European companies have a fair amount of capacity for building fighter jets, things like battle tanks are a different story.
Okay.
Demand for those has been low in recent years, so production capacity has shrunk.
So we've got the funding hurdles, the technology debates, the supplier dilemmas. It's starting to feel like a bit of a tangled web.
It is.
What's the path forward? Does the document offer any guidance on how to unravel all of this?
It does,
Okay.
but it's not a quick fix. The document identifies a few key bottlenecks that need to be addressed, and I think this is where we can really start to connect the dots for you.
Okay, let's unpack this. What are the biggest roadblocks standing in the way of Europe achieving this massive increase in defense production?
Christian Melling,
Okay.
a political scientist, lays out three major challenges: bureaucratic hurdles, funding uncertainties, and shortages of both raw materials and skilled labor.
Bureaucracy, the perennial thorn in the side of progress. I can practically hear the gears grinding to a halt already.
Right.
But let's focus on the labor shortage for a moment. You can't exactly build tanks with paperwork, right?
Exactly, and this is where things get really interesting.
Okay.
Because Melling sees a potential opportunity in a seemingly unrelated sector,
Okay.
the automotive industry.
Hold on. The automotive industry. Explain this one to me.
Well, as car manufacturers downsize and shift towards electric vehicles,
Okay.
they're laying off skilled workers, engineers, technicians, people with the exact kind of expertise that could be valuable in defense production.
So it's like a silver lining to the challenges the automotive industry is facing, a potential win-win for both sectors.
Potentially, the document even mentions a pilot project
Okay.
between Continental, a major automotive supplier, and Rheinmetall, a leading defense contractor.
Okay.
They're taking workers from Continental's shrinking combustion engine division and retraining them to work in Rheinmetall's defense plants.
Wow. So they're actually putting this idea into practice. That's pretty remarkable. It really highlights the human side of this story, the potential for people to find new opportunities in a sector that's suddenly facing this huge demand.
It also raises a broader question about the future of defense production.
Right.
Could this type of collaboration between private companies and the government, with a focus on retraining and workforce development, become a new model?
Yeah.
Could this be how Europe solves its labor shortage and boosts production?
That's a really intriguing question, and it speaks to the need for creative solutions, for thinking outside the box and finding ways to leverage existing resources. But I'm curious to hear more about what Melling proposes to address those other bottlenecks, the bureaucratic hurdles and the funding uncertainties.
Well, he doesn't mince words. He argues that swift political action is essential to cut through red tape and streamline the decision-making process.
Okay, that sounds good in theory, but what does that actually look like in practice? How do you get governments to move quickly on something as complex as defense production?
He also emphasizes the need for long-term funding guarantees to give companies the confidence to invest in expanding their production capacity.
Right, because businesses need to see that there's a stable demand for their products before they're going to sink millions or even billions into new facilities and equipment.
And he goes even further,
Okay.
proposing a more radical solution. a U.S.-style model where the government takes on more of the upfront risk.
What does that mean exactly?
He suggests that the government could take the lead on things like certification and infrastructure development,
Okay.
which are often the biggest hurdles for companies trying to scale up production quickly.
So less red tape, more government support. It's a pretty bold idea.
It is.
But I guess desperate times call for desperate measures, right?
It's certainly a departure from how things are typically done in Europe, but it's a conversation starter. It forces us to ask,
Mm.
what are we willing to do to meet this challenge? What sacrifices are we willing to make, and what kind of future do we want to build for European defense?
Well, on that note, I think we've covered a lot of ground in this first part of our deep dive. We've talked about the funding challenges, the technology choices, the supplier issues, and some potential solutions, but there's still a lot more to unpack.
There is.
And I think the next step is to really dive into the specifics of those potential solutions.
Right.
To explore their feasibility, their potential impact, and the trade-offs they might entail.
Absolutely.
Sounds like a plan. Let's take a quick break, and then we'll come back and really dig into those solutions.
Sounds good. So we've laid out this massive challenge facing the European defense industry, how to increase production dramatically and quickly. You know, when we talk about these potential solutions like shifting workers from the automotive industry, it's easy to get lost in the big picture.
Yeah. Sometimes I need to zoom back in and remind myself that we're talking about real people's lives here.
Absolutely.
Could this actually work on a large scale? It sounds promising.
Right.
But it's a huge undertaking.
It's not as simple as saying, okay, everyone who builds cars, now you build tanks.
Right.
You're talking about different skill sets, different production processes, even different workplace cultures.
Right. You can't just swap out a wrench for a welding torch and expect everything to run smoothly.
Exactly.
Defense production has its own unique set of standards and regulations.
And let's not forget the human element.
Right.
These are people who are being asked to switch careers, to learn new skills, to adapt to a whole new environment.
That pilot project between Continental and Rheinmetall,
Yeah.
that's what really struck me. They're actually taking concrete steps to make this happen.
A fascinating case study. It's like a microcosm of the larger challenge. They're trying to figure out how to integrate workers from different backgrounds, how to adapt their existing infrastructure, how to manage the logistics of this whole transition.
It's a real-world test of whether this idea can actually work.
Yeah.
If they succeed, it could be a model for other companies to follow.
And if they stumble, well, that's valuable information too. It helps us identify the potential roadblocks and adjust our expectations.
It's like a real-time experiment in industrial adaptation.
Yeah.
And the stakes are pretty high. I mean, if Europe can't find enough skilled workers, that's a major blow to its ambitions of boosting defense production.
Exactly. It all comes back to that central question. Can Europe deliver?
Right.
It's got the technology, it's got the resources, but can it put all the pieces together in time? This pilot project, I think, will give us some clues.
So let's shift gears for a moment and talk about those other bottlenecks that Mulling identified: the bureaucracy and the funding uncertainties. Those seem like pretty significant hurdles.
They are.
Maybe even bigger than the labor shortage in some ways.
They're interconnected, for sure. Mulling is pretty blunt in his assessment. He says Europe needs to cut through the red tape if it wants to move quickly.
Easier said than done, right? Bureaucracy has a way of entrenching itself. What are some concrete steps that could be taken?
He suggests streamlining the decision-making process, maybe even creating a dedicated task force with the authority to make quick decisions about funding, procurement, and regulations.
So a kind of wartime footing for the bureaucracy itself?
Right.
Interesting idea, but I imagine there would be resistance to that kind of centralization of power.
Probably, but that's where political will comes in.
Right.
If European leaders are serious about boosting defense production, they're going to have to make some tough choices.
Right.
And those choices might involve shaking up the status quo.
And what about the funding uncertainties? You mentioned earlier that businesses need to see a stable demand before they're willing to invest. How do you address that?
Mulling argues for long-term funding guarantees. Basically, governments need to signal to companies that they're in this for the long haul, that they're committed to supporting the defense industry, not just for the next year or two,
Right.
but for the next decade or more.
That makes sense, but it also requires a level of foresight and commitment that can be hard to come by in the political world, especially when budgets are tight and priorities are constantly shifting. Is that something European governments are even capable of?
It's a challenge, no doubt. But if they want to avoid a repeat of the situation they're in now where they're scrambling to catch up, they need to think strategically.
Right.
not just tactically.
And then there's that more radical proposal that you mentioned, the U.S.-style model of government, taking on more risk. What are the potential benefits and drawbacks of that approach?
Well, the potential benefit is speed. If the government takes the lead on things like certification and infrastructure development, it can potentially remove some of the biggest roadblocks for companies.
It's like the government is clearing the path for the private sector to come in and scale up production.
Exactly.
But what are the downsides? I imagine there are some concerns about government overreach, even inefficiency.
Those are valid concerns.
Yeah.
There's a risk of bureaucratic bloat cost, overruns, and delays. And you have to ask yourself, is the European system even set up for that kind of government intervention?
It's a very different model from what we're used to seeing in Europe.
It is.
So we've got these potential solutions, each with its own set of pros and cons. What's the takeaway here?
I think the takeaway is that there's no easy answer. This isn't just a technical challenge. It's a political and societal challenge. It requires a fundamental rethinking of how Europe approaches defense.
We've been talking a lot about the big picture here, the economics, the politics, the industrial challenges.
Right.
But I want to bring it back to the human element for a moment. We mentioned those workers who are being retrained from the automotive industry.
Yeah.
What are their stories? What are their hopes and fears as they make this transition?
That's a crucial part of this story that often gets overlooked. We need to understand the impact these changes are having on people's lives. Are they excited about this new opportunity? Are they worried about the future?
Are they feeling a sense of purpose, knowing that they're contributing to something bigger than themselves? Or are they just trying to make ends meet? These are questions that deserve to be explored.
And those stories can help us understand the broader implications of this shift in European defense. It's not just about numbers and statistics. It's about the human cost of rearmament. It's about the choices we make as a society and the values we prioritize.
I think that's an important point to emphasize. This isn't just some abstract policy debate. It has real consequences for real people.
Exactly. And those consequences extend far beyond the defense industry itself. They ripple through the economy. They shape our relationships with other countries. They influence our sense of security and identity.
It's like a domino effect, one decision leading to another, each with its own set of unintended consequences. And it makes you wonder, what does all of this mean for the average person? How will this massive increase in defense spending impact their lives?
Well, for starters, it's going to impact their wallets.
Yeah.
More money spent on defense means less money available for other things: education, healthcare, social services.
Right. There's a trade-off there, and it's a trade-off that every society has to grapple with. How much are we willing to spend on security, and what are we willing to sacrifice in return?
And it's not just about money. It's about priorities, about what we value as a society. Do we value security above all else, or are there other things that are equally important or even more important?
Tough questions, no easy answers, but they're questions that we need to be asking ourselves as individuals and as a society.
Because the choices we make today will shape the world we live in tomorrow.
And on that rather profound note, I think it's time to take another quick pause. When we come back, we'll wrap up our deep dive into European defense industry with some final thoughts and key takeaways. All right, we've been unpacking a lot in this deep dive.
We have.
And it's clear that the European defense industry is at a crossroads.
Yeah.
But before we wrap up, let's step back and try to connect all these threads for you. What are the key takeaways here?
Well, I think the most striking takeaway is the sheer scale of the challenge.
Right.
We're talking about a massive, rapid increase in production, unlike anything Europe has seen in decades. The financial commitment alone is staggering. And it's not just about writing a big check.
Right.
It's about making tough choices, about rethinking priorities, about potentially changing the very fabric of European industry and society.
And those choices are complex. We've talked about the debates over technology, the dependence on foreign suppliers, the bureaucratic hurdles, the labor shortages, the potential solutions. It's a tangled web, for sure.
It is.
But despite all that complexity, I have to say I'm cautiously optimistic.
Yeah.
We've seen some glimmers of hope. I keep thinking about that pilot project between Continental and Rheinmetall.
Right.
Retraining workers from the automotive industry. It's not just a Band-Aid solution.
Yeah.
It's a potential model for the future.
It shows that with a bit of creativity and collaboration, seemingly insurmountable obstacles can be overcome.
And it highlights the human side of this story. It's easy to get caught up in the numbers and the geopolitical maneuvering.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, this is about people. It's about the workers who are being asked to adapt and learn new skills. It's about the communities that are being impacted by these changes. It's about the citizens who are ultimately footing the bill.
It's about recognizing that rearmament has a human cost. And it's about ensuring that those costs are shared fairly and that everyone benefits from the increased security and stability that this investment is supposed to bring.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I'm left with a question for you to ponder. We've talked about the potential of that pilot project. But what if it's more than just a one-off success story? What if it's a sign of things to come? A blueprint for a new kind of defense industry?
Right.
One that's more agile, more responsive, and more integrated into the broader economy.
It's a question worth exploring. Can Europe leverage this moment of crisis to not just rebuild its defense capabilities, but to also reimagine its industrial base and its social contract?
Can it create a system that's not only effective in deterring threats, but also creates opportunity and prosperity for its citizens? That's the challenge and the opportunity facing Europe today.
And it's a challenge that will require not just financial resources, but also political courage, innovative thinking, and a willingness to embrace new ideas and new ways of doing things.
So stay informed, stay engaged, and stay curious. The future of European defense, and indeed the future of Europe itself, is being written right now, and you, the listener, have a role to play in shaping that future. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Thanks for having me.